In the spring of 1958, my mother hoisted me into our pickup truck, and she drove me to Dowling School, which was about a mile from our house. I was about 4 years old at the time, and I wouldn't turn 5 until the school year started in the fall, which meant that I couldn't enter kindergarten that year as a 4-year-old unless I had the approval of my kindergarten teacher. And so my mom set an appointment and took me to Dowling School so Mrs. Wickham could interview me and see if she thought I was ready to enter kindergarten. Well, apparently I passed the test because in the fall of that year I started kindergarten at Dowling, and Mrs. Wickham was my teacher. Now, Dowling School was a 2-room schoolhouse that was separated by 2 large wooden sliding doors. And Mrs. Wickham taught the 4 lower grades on one side of that door. Mrs. Kennedy taught the 4 upper grades on the other side of that door. And the 2 rooms in that school were about the same size, but since the little kids were in this side and the big kids were on that side, we called this one the little room and that one the big room. So Mrs. Wickham was not just my teacher in kindergarten, she was also my teacher in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grades. But even though my first 4 years took place in the same room with the same teacher, I don't remember many details about my 1st, 2nd, or 3rd grade years at Dowling. But I remember a lot of things about my kindergarten year. For example, I remember where I sat. When I walked in the front door of the school, I'd look to my left, and there was Mrs. Wickham's desk where she sat, and on the wall right behind her was a black phone that hung on the wall. And then over here, across right in front of her, were 2 short wooden tables, one here, one down there. And I sat at those tables, and we had little short wooden chairs. There were 3 chairs to a side. There was a little drawer that pulled out, 3 on a side, 1 for each student. We put our pencils, erasers, crayons, stuff like that in those drawers. And all those, and we had assigned seats. And mine was, as you look down, here's the first table. I was at the second table, the last seat on the right side, which meant that the wall was to my back, and in front of me was a whole classroom full of chairs, neatly lined up in rows, because that's where the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd graders sat. When I looked towards the front of the room, there was a big blackboard right in the middle of the wall at the front of the room, and there were about 12 wooden chairs that were positioned in a half moon around that blackboard. School started 8:30 every morning with Mrs. Wickham taking attendance. She would read our names off one at a time. We'd respond here, like that. And when attendance was done, we'd all stand to our feet. We'd put our hand over our heart. We'd face the flag. And we would say the Pledge of Allegiance together. Once all those preliminaries were finished, Mrs. Wickham would walk over to that blackboard up there in front of the room, and she would call the kindergarten class, the first class, to come up and sit in those wooden chairs at the front. And she would begin to teach us our first lesson of the day. Now, some days the lessons were about our ABCs. On other days it was about 1 + 1 and 2 + 2. And other days we learned to sound out letters and read simple words. And later in the year, Mrs. Wickham taught us how to read simple stories. But when our lesson was over, Mrs. Wickham would send us back to our seats with an assignment based on what we had just learned, things to work on, while she taught the next class that came up and sat in those same chairs. The 1st grade came up, then the 2nd grade came up, and the 3rd grade, and I watched that whole thing. I heard all of their lessons as a kindergarten. At 10:15, everyone would lay down their pencils, they'd put their books away, and we'd go outside for recess. And 15 minutes later, Mrs. Wickham would pick up her little bell that she kept on her desk. She'd open up the door. She'd step outside. She'd ring that bell like that. And we'd hear it. And we'd all come running back in. And we'd sit down at our desks and our tables. And we would resume classes. Well, I learned quickly that you couldn't talk in school while it was in session. I learned that I couldn't chew gum or get a snack when I wanted one. if nature called or the lead on my pencil broke, I had to raise my hand and get permission to go to the restroom or go over and use the pencil sharpener. It was attached to the wall. By noon, my day at school was over, but before I could leave, I had to clear off my table and pick up all the trash that was around my chair and then sit quietly and wait for my mother to come pick me up while the older kids ate their lunch and then went outside to play. It was a simple routine with a simple curriculum. The whole thing only took half a day, and yet I have more memories about my time in kindergarten than I do the next 3 years combined. I mean, when I went to first, second, third grade, I had my own desk. I mean, I could had my stuff under my desk. It was all mine. I was there for twice as long as I was as a kindergartner. I learned things during those times that were much more advanced, and yet I have no memory of where I sat during those 3 years. And I have very few memories of what I did or what specific things we learned in those 3 grades. So my question is why? Why is that true? I attended Dowling School for 7 years. I spent 4 years in the little room. I spent 3 years in the big room before they closed it, consolidated schools, shuffled us off to bigger schools. And yet the year that I have the most memories about is my kindergarten year when I was 5 years old and spent half a day in school. My question is why? Why do I remember the year I learned my ABCs more vividly than the year I learned to diagram a sentence or to write a theme or to do long division? Well, I think the reason that I have more memories about my kindergarten year is because I didn't just learn my ABCs in kindergarten. I learned the ABCs of life in kindergarten there at Dowling School. I learned about arriving at school on time before I could tell time. I learned about being quiet and respecting my teacher before I could spell respect. When I got up, put my hand over my heart, took the Pledge of Allegiance to my country, I got my first taste of patriotism before I knew anything about American history. When we sat down in those 12 chairs in front of the blackboard, I didn't just learn my ABCs, I learned how to put those letters together to form words. And then I learned how to read simple stories about somebody named Dick and Jane and Sally and their cat Puff and their dog Spot, you know. I didn't just learn my ABCs, I learned the ABCs of literacy that year. I didn't just learn to count and recognize my numbers, I learned that 1 + 1 is 2 and 4 - 3 is 1. I learned the ABCs of math that year. Kindergarten was there. It was in kindergarten where I discovered that I could learn in a group if I had a good teacher, and I could learn on my own if I practiced what the teacher gave me to take back and build upon the things I had just learned. It was in kindergarten that I learned that by taking a short break called recess, it made it easier to concentrate on our studies when I returned. I discovered that asking questions when I didn't understand something was a very important part of learning. In short, I learned the ABCs of learning. It was in kindergarten that I made my first friends outside of my family, and it was in kindergarten I had to deal with my first bully who wouldn't get off a teeter-totter, you know. The first time I ever told a story and shared a piece of my life in front of people who didn't really know me that well was in kindergarten. Mrs. Wickham called it show and tell. It was in kindergarten that I discovered that I like friendly competition because we'd all run out on the playground at noon. We'd see who could swing the highest in the swing, who could go the fastest on the merry-go-round, and who could jump the furthest off when he came off the slicky slide. In short, I think the reason I remember so much about kindergarten is that I didn't just learn my ABCs in kindergarten. I learned the ABCs of life there in kindergarten. I laid the foundation stones for my education in that year. Even to this day, much of my life is built upon the foundational truths that I learned in that little class in kindergarten. But apparently I'm not the only person who has come to this conclusion, because in one of the best-selling books in 1986, and a book that's still popular today, 40 years later, is entitled Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. 7 million people have purchased that book over the last 40 years, And in it, the author argues that when his life isn't making sense or when his relationships seem to be falling apart, it's often because he's ignoring the foundational truths that he learned in kindergarten. But if he also discovered that when he returned to those foundational truths, ordered his life around them once again, his life made more sense and many of his relational problems disappeared. Well, today we're going to start a new series that suggests that same truth plays out in your life and mine when we ignore the foundational truths that God laid down in a place called the Garden of Eden. Because that garden is our kindergarten. It's the place where God teaches us the foundational truths that we need to learn if we're going to function and thrive in this world. Because it is in the Garden of Eden that we learn who we are. It's where we learn what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. It's in the garden that we we first learn about the value of work, about the design of marriage, about the central role of the family. It is in Eden that we learn the ABCs of worship and what it means to subdue the earth without destroying the earth. Eden doesn't tell us everything we need to know about life, but it is where God teaches us the ABCs of life. It's where God gives us the foundational truths that we need to build our lives upon if we want to thrive in this world. The curriculum of Eden is short. The truths that it teaches are pretty simple and easy to learn. But if you ignore those truths and turn your back on them, the wheels will begin to fall off your life. It's like forgetting your ABCs and trying to read. It just doesn't work. So currently, right now in our culture, two things are happening in America at the same time. On one hand, we're seeing an unprecedented level of chaos and destruction and meaninglessness and evil play out in our nation because many in America have turned their backs on the ABCs of life that God laid down in Eden. And so whether you're redefining marriage or killing babies or insisting that there are 32 genders or rioting in the streets or proclaiming that men are toxic or putting men in women's locker rooms or allowing our children to be sexually exploited or refusing to prosecute evil men or assassinating people who don't agree with you. All of those self-destructive choices are happening because those who promote them have turned their backs on the ABCs of life that God gave us, taught us, laid down in Eden. But at the same time that we are witnessing this unprecedented level of evil and insanity in our country, we're also seeing a counter movement. There are many in our country, especially in our younger generations, that are returning to church and returning to God, and they're doing so by the thousands because they're looking for answers. They're longing for something ancient, something true, something that doesn't change with the whims of men. And they're pretty sure that they're not going to find it in the insanity that's being promoted by the woke elites of our country. And so they're showing up at church and they're turning to God to try to find the answers they're looking for. Now, you may be here today because you're one of those folks. I mean, you're longing for something that you can build your life, your marriage, your family, your career, your society upon. You took one look at the crazy stuff that's going on in the streets, and they're waving banners, and they're calling and demanding that we defund the police and kill babies and dismantle families and replace parents with the state, and free killers and protect terrorists. You look at that stuff and you took one look at it and you said, I don't know all the answers, but I know they don't have the answers. Those guys are nuts, We're not going there. And so you bought a Bible. You started reading it. And you decided to come to Horizons to see if you could find what you're looking for. Because you're longing for something. You're longing for something ancient, something true, something unchanging, something foundational that you can build your life upon. Now, if that's you, what you're looking for is Eden. And what you're longing for is for someone to take you back where it all began so you can rediscover the foundational truths that you can build your life upon. What you're looking for is the ABCs of life. And where you'll find them, those ABCs, is in Eden. And so in this series, we're going to take you back to where it all began. We're going to take you back to the Garden of Eden and rediscover the foundational truths that God laid down for us there so that we could thrive in this world. We're going to discover what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. We're going to discover the ABCs of work, of marriage, of family life, of worship, of dominion, because these are the foundational truths that everything else in your life is built upon. Get these things wrong, and the wheels will start falling off your life and off your relationships. So, where do we start in this journey? Where do we start? Well, we start where God started. We start with the making of a man. Because when God wanted to build the first family, where did he start? He started by making a man. When God wanted to create a society, the first building block of that society that laid down was a man. The Garden of Eden didn't even exist until God made a guy. He made a man. And then he put him in that garden, and he told him to keep it and tend it. He gave him a job. But the idea that God created men to play a critical role in society is it's really not a very popular notion in the secular world. You know, much of our culture has declared war on manhood. They just think that it's something we need to get over and get past. You know, the mantra of the feminist movement for years, decades, has been that women can do whatever a man can do, and therefore men are just unnecessary. One of the central tenets of wokeism is that men are toxic, and therefore their leadership in the home and in society is unwanted. It should be rejected because it's just a form of patriarchy, they say. The constant themes of Hollywood are that men are either incompetent dunces or abusive brutes. Even the ad agencies they seem duty-bound to create commercials that make men look stupid or incompetent or effeminate in order to sell their products. And of course, our enlightened society decided that the Boy Scouts couldn't be just for boys to help them become men because, well, that would be sexist, you know. And so they reimagined Boy Scouts and turned it into Scouting America so girls could attend. But they kept Girl Scouts as a girls-only organization. Well, such things have not gone unnoticed by men. When I got married 53 years ago, that was a while back, I was, I had to be, 10 years old back then, right? Something like that. When I got married 53 years ago, I was 20. And that was considered normal. I was coming up on 20, about 21, 20 and a half, something like that. That was considered a normal age to get married. But as the war on men has ramped up, so has the age of the average guy for when he gets married. The average guy now says, I do, not when he's about 20, but when he's about 30. At least part of the reason for that change is because our society insists that men should not be men. God designed us to lead. God designed us to thrive when we're needed. It's part of our wiring. So when our society tells us that we're not needed in our marriage and our leadership in the home isn't wanted, well, apparently it takes us about 10 more years to talk ourselves into saying, I do. But when men are allowed to be men, when they're allowed to do that, they don't have a problem. They don't have a problem with commitment. They don't have a problem with marriage or with hard work. When men are allowed to be men, they don't have a problem putting their life on the line for their families or serving their country. They don't have a problem with that. I don't know if you've noticed, but the same young men who are putting off marriage are signing up for the military in droves. Every branch of our military is exceeding its recruitment numbers because young men know that the current administration will not emasculate them. Rather, they will let them be men. And so young men who are barely 20 years of age are saying, hey, where do I sign up? And I think if we're paying attention, there's a message in that for the church. There's a message in that for our culture. You know, I hear a lot of people complaining that young men are content to sit around with their friends and play video games rather than making a commitment, getting a job, and saying, I do. And I'm sure there's more than one reason why that's true. But I'm also sure that if we want young men to get off the couch, get a job, and say, I do, we got to go back to the beginning and let men be men. We got to go back to Eden and relearn the ABCs of manhood, and then let those men lead their families. That's what they were created to do. He said, lead your family so that your family, you and your family together, can reshape the world that you touch. You can transform a piece of it together. But he says, I want you to lead it. Now that brings us to our first life principle. God made men first. That is, he made man, then he made Adam, then he made Eve. He made man first because we are to lead our families as we shape the world together. We shape the world together with our families. It's something we do together, but God needs a leader in that. And he says, men, I've tapped you for that task as part of your calling. Now, the order of creation, it was not random. God didn't just Forrest Gump this thing, right? There are important truths that are embedded in how God created the first man and when he created him. You know, in the first 6 days of creation, God normally spoke things into existence. Sometimes he created things, what the Bible calls ex nihilo, out of nothing. Other times, God took things that already were in existence and used them as raw material to make a new thing. For example, in Genesis 1:3, God says, let there be light. And there was light. Ex nihilo, out of nothing. I mean, God made light 3 days before he made the sun, moon, or stars. He made light so the world was illuminated. If that wasn't true, we'd still be waiting for light to get here from outer space. Now, God says, look, I made light, and he made it ex nihilo, out of nothing. But in Genesis 1:24, God said, let the earth, something he already made. Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kind, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth. That is, God used the water, the soil that he'd already made on day one. He used it as raw material. Then he spoke mammals and reptiles and insects into existence using that raw material. But in Genesis, on the sixth day of creation, when God made the first man, he didn't do it that way. He didn't call him into existence by divine fiat like he did the rest of creation. Rather, God formed the first man using the dust of the earth. He shaped him, and he crafted Adam's body like an artist would shape and craft a piece of clay. And when God had fashioned Adam's body to be just the form that he wanted it to be, he breathed life into this inanimate form that was stretched out in front of him. And that lifeless form became a living soul. And since God made that first man from the Adamah, the dust of the earth, he called that first man Adam. The Bible says it like this. Then the Lord formed the man, Adam. That's the word. He formed him from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature, a living soul. And the Lord planted a garden in Eden in the east, further east from where he created Adam. And there he put the man whom he had formed, he put him in that garden. Now, the Bible tells us that God fashioned, he formed, he created even Adam and breathed life into his lifeless body in an undeveloped area that was somewhere west of a place he called Eden. Adam was created in a perfect world, but he wasn't created in a developed world that could easily sustain him. And so once Adam was created, God went further east. He went over here to an area called Eden. And it was a place where 3 rivers converged. And he created a habitat that was specially designed for Adam so he could live there and thrive there. And he called that place that he created the Garden of Eden. And when he was finished with it, he placed Adam in that garden, and then he put him in charge of it and says, till it, keep it, it's your job. So Adam was made first before God made Eve. Rather than speaking Adam into existence, he did like he did for the animal world. God formed Adam. He shaped him. He fashioned him. And then he breathed life into his inanimate form, and he became a living soul. Now, God took these special measures with Adam because he was unlike any other creature on the planet. You know, birds, reptiles, insects, fish, mammals were all physically alive. But God gave Adam something that no other creature on the planet possessed. He gave him an immaterial soul, a soul that was made in the image and likeness of God. And that soul not only made Adam an eternal being, it also made him a moral being who could make choices and was responsible for his choices. He made him into a being who could communicate. He could communicate with God, and ultimately he'd be able to communicate with other image bearers. And he would, because he had these abilities, he'd be able to oversee God's creation. The Bible said it like this. He said, God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion, oversight, over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God made the man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. He put him in two versions. There was male and female, he created them. By the way, not 32, two, all right? Two, male and female. And God blessed them. And he said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, God doesn't possess a physical body. The Bible says God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. He is not material, he is immaterial. And therefore, when God made Adam in his image, the image that he gave him was not his physical body, because God doesn't have one. His image that he gave him was his immaterial, eternal soul. Because when God gave Adam a soul, he was able to do things that God could do, but no other creature on the planet could do. For example, he could imagine something that new, something that didn't exist. He could design how to make that thing that didn't exist. Then he could take the raw materials out here and create that thing. No other creature on the planet can do that. A bird can create a nest because he instinctually knows how to create a nest. But go find a bird's nest with a jacuzzi hanging off the edge of it. It doesn't happen because birds don't have the ability to imagine, design, and create. That's distinctively human. Likewise, he bore the image of God. He had the ability to think complex thoughts, to reason, to write poetry, to create music, to feel a wide range of emotions. Because he had God's image, he had a conscience. He knew right from wrong and was held accountable for his choices of right and wrong. A fox goes out, kills a rabbit. God doesn't come down and say, murderer, we're going to try you for killing the rabbit. No, they're not moral creatures that live upon, well, we are. He turns to us and says, I hold you responsible not only for how you treat each other, but for how you treat animals. And so God made us responsible to treat them well. So we are moral creatures that are held responsible for our choices. And because we are these moral creatures with this complex ability, we can put our thoughts and our feelings and our moral convictions and our dreams into words, and we can communicate not only with God, but ultimately Adam would be able to communicate with other human beings like himself when they showed up on the earth. And because Adam had all this unique abilities, God put him in charge of not only the garden, but he says, I'm giving you dominion over the earth, over all of my creation. Now, later that same day, Adam would realize that he wasn't alone in the garden, and he didn't like that. And he said, so God put him to sleep. He created a female companion for Adam. He called her Eve. She too possessed the image of God. But God didn't create Eve out of the inanimate dust like he did Adam. Instead, he created Eve by taking a piece of living flesh from Adam's side, because God's plan was that all of mankind, including Eve, would proceed from and come from this guy named Adam. And in the process of her creation, Eve was infused with the image of God, just like Adam had, And she was given the same unique dignity, the same unique worth as Adam possessed, because both of them now bore the image of God. Then God told Adam and Eve, hey, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. Well, what are they supposed to multiply? They multiply image bearers. Because as image bearers, Adam and Eve not only had the ability to create and pass on their physical life to their children, but they had the ability to pass on and pass on to their kids this eternal soul that they had, this image of God in them, was passed on naturally to their kids through procreation. So just as God used Adam to infuse Eve with the image of God, God then used Adam and Eve to infuse their kids with the image of God. They didn't give them just their physical bodies, they gave them their immaterial, eternal souls as well. So my question is, why did God make Adam first? Why didn't he just make both Adam and Eve from the dust of the earth at the same time? Well, I can tell you, it was not an accident. God didn't stumble into that decision. It was intentional. God created Adam first because God designed Adam to lead his family. That's the reason he put him first. He made him first. That's not patriarchy. That's the ABCs of life. When Paul was asked why men should bear this burden of leadership in the home and in the church, he literally said in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13, the reason why he's responsible, the reason why he bears this responsibility, he says, and I quote, because Adam was created first and then Eve. There is a lesson, there's a message for us in the creation order. Part of the ABCs of Eden is that God created Adam first because God created him to lead his family so his family could exercise dominion over the earth and they could do that together. God told both Adam and Eve to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, exercise dominion over the earth, but God made Adam first because he wanted him to lead his family in that endeavor. Now, it's true that sin has made leading other people harder. It's true that sin has made cooperating with leaders more challenging. But the fall of man and the entrance of sin didn't change God's design for men. God made you to lead. Sin made having babies painful. But we didn't stop having babies. We still have babies. Sin made work hard, but we still work. In the same way, sin makes it difficult to lead others and to cooperate with flawed leaders. But we still need men to lead their families. We still need men to step up and be leaders in the church and in our society. Because God designed you, man. He designed you as a man to lead. It is your calling. And God expects you to live into that calling. He expects you to lead your family. He expects you to lead in ministry. He expects you to impact the society around you. But to do that, you just cannot. You cannot imitate the world. You have to act like the man that God created you to be. The world, the world equates leadership with control. And it will abuse and mistreat anyone who resists that control. You know that's true. You've seen it happen. But God didn't call you to be a controller, man. He called you to be a leader, a person that respectfully influences others to good places. He called you to go first. He called you to model the way. And he called you to honor the dignity and value of the image bearers that you lead. Men, God has given you a calling. But to fulfill that calling, you cannot act like the world. You must act like the men God made you to be. And that brings us to our second life principle. Men must act like men if we are to live into our God-given calling. Men can't imitate the world and fulfill this calling. Men have to act like the men God made you to be if you're going to fulfill this calling. Now, when the Apostle Paul ended the book of 1 Corinthians, he made a call to the readers of that book. He says, I want you to act like men. Well, what does that mean, Paul? Well, in that verse, he then explains through a series of short bursts what it means to act like men. This is what he said. Here's what I want you to do. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong, and let all that you do be done in love. Those 5 statements give us a profile of what it means to act like men. And so in the time we've got left, what I want to do is I just want to talk to you briefly about each of those 5 statements. And let's start with this first one, be watchful. Because when God tells you to be watchful, what he's calling you to, men, is to be a protector. To watch over something is to guard something. It's to protect something. When he says be watchful, he's calling on you to be a protector. It's no mistake that men are just kind of naturally drawn to the military and to police work. It just kind of plays to our strength. It's in our DNA to be on guard. It's in our DNA to protect the innocent, to protect people we love, protect our country that we love. Do you know when God gave Adam his first job, we always think about it as he just said, well, tend the garden. No, he said, first thing he said was, I want you to keep it and tend it. Keep is the Hebrew word for to protect, to guard. I want you to be a protector of the garden. God knew evil was coming. He said, Adam, I want you to stand in the gap, and I want you to protect the garden from the evil that's coming. Evil will soon be there. God designed him to be a protector, and then he put him in charge of protecting the garden. You see, men, when God has given you a protective instinct and he wants you to use it to keep your family safe, when evil threatens to harm them, he wants you to stand in the gap and protect the kingdom of God. When evil knocks at the door of the kingdom and says, we want to tear down the truths and the principles of God's word, he expects you to be a protector, to stand in the gap, and be the difference maker that keeps that from happening. You know, on July 20th, 2012, a young man turned his back on this calling to be a protector, and he picked up a gun. He stepped into a theater at the midnight showing of Dark Knight Rising. It happened in Aurora, Colorado, and he murdered 12 people and he injured 70 more. It wasn't the act of a man, it was the petulant tantrum of a boy who had turned his back on Eden and walked away from his calling as a man. Many of you probably remember the story when it played out on the nightly news. But what you may not know is that 3 young men died that night protecting their girlfriends from this killer. When the bullets started flying, their instinct was to protect the person they loved. And so they stepped between the bullets and their girlfriends, and they shielded them from certain death because they understood that if they're going to act like a man, they had to be a protector. Now, one man turned his back on his calling that night and became a murderer. 3 men lived into their calling and became protectors and gave their life for it. The question is, which will you be? Which of those 2 men are you going to be? But God not only calls upon you to be a protector, he also calls upon you to be a rock. He calls upon you, he says, to be steadfast, to stand firm in the faith, to be a rock when it comes to the truth. If you want to act like a man, you have to be a rock, because God has called you to stand firm when everybody else is running, for cover. He wants you to stand in the gap. There are certain truths that the world hates. They'll criticize you for it. They will malign you for it. They'll find ways to punish you for believing those truths, for teaching those truths, for living out those truths. We'll probably take a few hits for even preaching this sermon, because the secular world really doesn't like the ABCs of Eden. They really don't. But God has called us. He's called his church to be the pillar and the ground of the truth, and he's called us as men to step up and to lead when it comes to defending God's truth and upholding that truth in the face of opposition. It's on our job description. It's what he's called us to do. One of my 2 favorite men in the Old Testament is a guy named Eleazar and a guy named Shammah. They were 2 of David's mighty men. We're told about them, 2 Samuel 23. Both of those men stood firm like a rock in the face of in the face of Philistine attacks. We're told that while other men were running, Eleazar stood firm and he fought off the Philistines, and he fought until his hand clung to his sword and he couldn't let go of it. Shammah, likewise, took his stand in the middle of a lentil patch. The Philistines came, everybody else ran. He turned around in the middle of a lentil patch, a patch of peas, and he said, I'm claiming this ground as God's ground, and I'll stand and I'll fight here. I'll die here if I have to. And God gave him a great victory, the Bible says. Boys run away when things get hard. They give up their faith to save their own skin. But men stand in the gap. They stand like a rock. They defend the faith when it's assaulted, because men know, they know that they were created for just such a moment. And so they stand. So God says, hey, so be a protector, be a rock. But to do that, you got to be courageous. You got to be courageous. He says, act like men. But the phrase in 1 Corinthians 16:13, when he says act like men, if you translate it literally, it says be courageous like men. Because courage and manhood are linked at the hip. Men are courageous. Courage is something that is uniquely and profoundly a requirement for men. Here's the thing about courage, though. For an action to be courageous, it requires the possibility that you may experience loss or harm if you do the right thing. If you know there's no possibility of experience loss or being harmed for doing the right thing, it may be noble, but it's not courageous. You know, we've all seen Superman standing in front of Lois Lane, you know, with his arms out and bullets bouncing off his chest so she's not hurt, right? We've all seen that. That's a noble act, but that's not a courageous act, because Superman knows those bullets can't hurt him. He can't be harmed by that. It's a noble act, but it's not a courageous act. On the other hand, Eric Liddell was a courageous man. Now, you probably know Eric Liddell as a man from the movie Chariots of Fire who gave up his chance to win a gold medal in the 1924 Olympics at Paris. He was fastest man in the world at the 100-meter dash. But that race was going to be held on Sunday, and Eric was the son of a Scottish missionary, and he believed that he would dishonor his father if he competed in that race on a Sunday. So out of respect for his Savior, he refused to run. Even though he was a shoo-in to win that and win a gold medal, he said, I'm not going to do it. Later that week, he did run a 200-meter race, took silver, ran a 400-meter race, took gold. But he became known around the world as a man who gave up the gold medal for God. Well, Eric went on to become, after the Olympics, he went to seminary and became a missionary like his parents. And he went to China like his parents. In fact, he was in China serving as a missionary when the Second World War began and the Japanese invaded China. But when the Japanese began beheading men and raping women, Eric sent his wife and daughters to Canada to keep them safe, but he stayed and kept ministering to the people of China who were under such duress. He stayed knowing that the Japanese soldiers could turn on him at any time. That's courage. Ultimately, Eric was arrested. He was placed in a concentration camp with 300 other people. He suffered terribly. But when the Japanese realized that the famous Eric Liddell, who ran in the Olympics, was in their prison, in their concentration camp, they arranged to have him travel to Canada and be reunited with his wife and his daughters. But instead of leaving, Eric petitioned the Japanese to give their ticket to a woman in the concentration camp who was about to give birth. And they did. And that act of kindness and that act of courage cost Eric his life, because Eric Liddell died in that concentration camp at the age of 43. And so to act like men, we have to be courageous, but you can't be courageous unless you're strong. And that's the fourth mark of a man. He says, be strong. You got to be strong and courageous. You can't be courageous unless you're strong in your faith, strong in your emotions, strong in your soul. God says, act like men, be strong. When I was going to Grace Seminary, you know, I saw a lot of guys I went there with drop out. They quit. It's hard. Seminary was hard. Stretched me beyond what I thought I could do. And I'd see guys be there 1 week and pack up and go on the next. I think I seldom, last week of the year of seminary, I seldom slept in bed. I would work until I couldn't focus anymore. I'd study, and then I'd lay down on the floor and go to sleep, so I would wake up in 2 hours, and I could go back and finish my studies and then go to class and come home and do the whole thing again. That went on like that, like a meat grinder. In the middle of all that, someone asked me to write a devotional on a 3x5 card and put it on a student bulletin board to encourage other guys at the seminary. And I don't remember everything that I wrote in the card, but I remember the final sentence was, it's always too early to quit. I don't know how many guys came to me over the next few weeks and thanked me for those 6 simple words. Guy after guy told me, I was ready to pack it in, and I read your little note, and I decided to stay, and I'm glad I did, and thank you. Thank you for challenging me. But all I did was call upon them to act like men. All I did was ask them to be strong. Boys quit when things get hard. Men get strong, and they stay. And so, if you're thinking about tapping out because your marriage is hard or parenting is tough or your job is thankless, I would remind you, it's always too early to quit. You don't get strong by quitting. You get strong by staying. But there is one more mark. There is one more mark of a man that shapes all these other 4. Because the last thing that God tells us, he says, let all that you do as a man be done in love. Or to say it another way, temper your strength with love. Let all that you do be done in love. Paul ends his call to manhood by reminding us to temper our strength with love. And men who ignore this final injunction, they end up betraying their calling. They become toxic men and that the secular world hates and that their wives and children despise and fear. You've got to be strong to act like men. You've got to be steadfast and courage to fulfill your calling. But if you do all these things and you don't temper your strength with love, you'll just become an arrogant brute rather than a loving leader. You'll use your strength to intimidate the people who are weaker than you, to get your way. But God didn't call you to be weak. He called you to be strong enough to be a dangerous force against evil in this world. And he also called you to be self-controlled enough that you would temper your strength with love so you would serve and you would protect the people that you lead. When I was growing up, my dad lost his job. He worked in a upholstery shop. And while he was looking for another one, we had to pinch pennies to make things work, you know. And one of the things my mom did to save our family a little money was she made her own bread. We didn't buy bread for a couple of years. And I would watch my mother sift flour and mix it up in a big bowl with milk and salt and butter. But before she broke that dough up into loaves and baked it, she'd put a packet of yeast in the dough and mix it into it. And then she would take that big thing of dough in a big bowl and put a towel over it and set it in a warm place. And pretty soon I'd see that towel begin to rise. And that because the yeast was doing its work, it was making the bread rise. My mom would wait until the bread had actually lifted the towel completely off the bowl, and then she'd break it up into lumps. She'd put it into bread pans, slip it into the oven, and when the top of that bread was golden brown, she'd pull those pans out, turn them over, flip them like that, take a big stick of butter and rub it on the top of those golden loaves. And then she'd take a big knife and she'd cut off the heel, that first big piece, and then she'd slather it with butter. I mean, dripping off your hand butter, you know? And she'd hand it to me. And it was just a little bit of heaven in a hard time. You know what made that bread so light, so airy, so good? It was the yeast. It was the yeast. Without the yeast, it was just a tough piece of dough that was flat and it was hard and you just couldn't eat it. Love is like that when it comes to leadership. Love is like that in leadership because if you don't add love, if you don't temper your strength with love, if you don't add love to your leadership will never rise. It'll produce something hard. It'll produce something flat. It'll produce something that nobody wants. But if you'll temper your strength with love, your leadership will rise. And you'll give your family a little taste of heaven in hard times. So be a protector. Be a rock. Be courageous. Be strong. But don't forget to temper all those things with love, because that's what makes your leadership rise. And that's what makes you able to give something good to the people you lead. Let me just end with 2 things. If you want to help our young boys become men, we have a ministry called Trail Life. And you can either talk to the people out here, they have a display, or you can go to the back of your thing here. It's got a little QR code, or tap that little thing in front of you with your phone, and a series of options will come up. Pick the one that says Trail Life. I want to help with that and become part of that. Help lead, help become part of that. And the other thing is, you and as men, we need heroes. We need heroes. We need guys who have gone before us and have gone first and show us how to leave our fingerprints upon the world and make the world a better place and make our families a good place. One of the best ways to do that, easy way to do that, is to read biographies. And Eric Metaxas has written a book called 7 Men. It gives 7 brief biographies of 7 different Christians who have left their fingerprints on the world. It's easy to read. If you don't like reading, you can get it in audio format as an audio book. You can scan the QR code. You can go to the sticker on this and tap the sticker, and it come up and just pick, hey, I want to go to the 7 Men's book. And it'll take you there where you can pick it up at Amazon. If you like what you read, he wrote a sequel. Guess what his name? 7 More Men. All right? But in the meantime, live into your calling, men. Act like men. Lead your families. Go first in ministry. Fulfill what God called you to do. But do it well. Do it well. And the only way to do it well is to act like the man.